When he stepped into the bathroom and saw me standing there, soaked and exposed, everything stopped, not just for him, but for me too. The hot water was still cascading over my back, yet I felt a cold jolt in my chest, like reality had slipped and left me vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in years. He froze. I gasped. Time distorted in that awkward, impossible second. I should have screamed. I should have grabbed a towel or pushed him out, but instead, we both just stared. His eyes flickered with something I didn't understand at the time, something more than surprise. Then he mumbled an apology and backed out, shutting the door with trembling fingers. I leaned my forehead against the tile wall, trying to catch my breath, and that was the moment I realized something had shifted. Not just in the air. In me. Because when I wrapped the towel around myself, my hands weren't just shaking from shock. They were shaking because something deeper, something dormant, had stirred. It was just a mistake. A simple accident. That's what I told myself again and again. But the way his eyes had locked with mine, that didn't feel accidental. And the worst part? I didn't want to forget it. Before I tell you what really happened in the weeks that followed, before everything unraveled in ways I never expected, tell me, have you ever had a moment that seemed small, but changed the entire course of your life? Let me take you back to where it all began. 7 years into a marriage doesn't sound like a long time until you're the one living each of those years like a season that refuses to change. Our house wasn't unhappy. It was quiet. Predictable. The kind of quiet that doesn't bring peace but presses against your chest until your breathing adjusts to the silence. He wasn't a cruel man. Just busy. Always occupied with work, numbers, calls. The kind of presence that fills a room without ever really touching it. We shared meals, chores, and a bed. But we hadn't truly shared each other in months, maybe longer. I used to count the days. Then I stopped. When his sister called to ask if her son could stay with us for a few weeks while he settled into his new internship in the city, I didn't hesitate. I said yes, even smiled politely into the phone, not realizing how that one decision would fracture the delicate balance I'd been clinging to. I hadn't seen him in years. He used to visit when he was younger, all awkward limbs and oversized hoodies. But when he arrived that Saturday afternoon, dragging 2 suitcases and wearing a calm, easy grin, I barely recognized him. Taller, broader, older, of course he was, but there was something else. A kind of quiet attentiveness in the way he looked at me, as if he was searching for something. Or seeing it already. I showed him to the guest room and offered coffee. He accepted with a thank you that felt too genuine for such a small gesture. We chatted about his internship, about how much the city had changed. He asked questions about the neighborhood, about the best place to get groceries, about me, little things that my husband hadn't asked in years. I felt seen. And I hated that it mattered. That first week passed in fragments. Mornings of shared silence over breakfast. Evenings where I'd find his dishes already rinsed, his shoes placed neatly by the door. He wasn't intrusive, just present. Considerate. The kind of presence that doesn't shout, but lingers in your awareness like a scent you can't name. I caught myself pausing at his bedroom door once, mid-walk to the laundry. I don't know why. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe not. My husband didn't notice anything. He barely noticed me. When he was home, he was on the phone. When he wasn't, he was asleep in the chair with the TV murmuring in the background. One night, I asked him if he wanted to go out, just the two of us. He blinked at me as if I'd spoken a different language. Maybe next week, he muttered. That was Tuesday. By Friday, he hadn't brought it up again. And then it happened. The day was normal. I'd done laundry, made lunch, answered a few emails. I was in the shower, rinsing conditioner from my hair, when the door creaked open. I turned instinctively and froze. He stood there, wide-eyed, lips parted as if words had failed him. For a second, we both stood suspended in confusion and something else, an emotion that felt like heat rising too fast. My first reaction should have been to scream, to cover up, to slam the door. But I just stared. So did he. I'm sorry, he said, voice low and panicked. He backed out quickly, shutting the door behind him. I sank against the tile, water rushing over me like a blanket I couldn't feel. My heart thundered. Not from fear. Not even from shame. From something I hadn't felt in years. Something dangerous. My hands were shaking as I turned off the tap and reached for the towel. The mirror was fogged, and I didn't wipe it. I couldn't look at myself. All evening, I avoided him. I avoided my husband too, though for different reasons. I didn't know what I was more afraid of, that he might notice something had changed in me, or that he wouldn't. That night, I lay in bed beside a man who hadn't touched me in months, and all I could think about was the look in another man's eyes. Not a stranger. Not someone I could erase or forget. Someone inside this house. Someone my husband trusted. Someone I was supposed to treat like family. I tried to rationalize it. It was a misunderstanding. An awkward moment. Nothing more. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was more complicated. More human. It wasn't about desire. Not really. It was about being noticed. About feeling alive. About remembering that my body, my presence, my being still meant something. I knew the danger. I felt the guilt curling around my ribs like ivy, tightening with every breath. But I also felt something else. Something that whispered, for the first time in a long time, you are not invisible. I wish I could say that was the end. That nothing more came of it. That we went on pretending. But some things can't be undone. And even the smallest cracks, once formed, only grow with time. The next morning, everything felt exaggerated. The sound of the kettle whistling, the creak of the floor beneath my bare feet, the distant hum of traffic beyond the window, it all seemed louder, sharper, like the world was pressing in on me, demanding I make sense of what had happened. But there was nothing to make sense of. It had been a mistake. A moment of accidental exposure. And yet, beneath that explanation lay something I couldn't silence, a pulse of tension I hadn't felt in years. He was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. He turned slightly as I entered, offering a soft good morning that felt far too gentle for my fraying nerves. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and busied myself with pouring coffee I didn't want to drink. I could feel his presence like heat on my skin, not invasive, but there. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was charged. Like static waiting for the right moment to strike. We went about our morning as if everything were normal. My husband had already left for work early, as usual. The house, though occupied, felt like it belonged to someone else. I cleaned the counters twice, pretended to read a magazine, anything to keep my hands moving, to stop the tremor in my fingers. By mid-afternoon, I found myself checking my reflection in the hallway mirror, not for vanity but to confirm I still looked like myself. My hair was pulled back. No makeup. A plain gray shirt. Nothing suggestive, nothing deliberate. But still, I hesitated before walking into the living room where he sat with his laptop, feet propped casually on the edge of the sofa. He looked up as I passed by and smiled, nothing more. Just a small curve of his lips, a gesture that might have meant nothing from anyone else, but from him it caught in my chest. Later, I stood at the sink, scrubbing a dish I had already cleaned twice, when I felt a presence behind me. Not close, just within reach. I didn't turn. He didn't speak. But the way the air shifted, the way the space between us seemed to pulse, it was enough. Enough to remind me that something unspoken now stretched between us, thin as thread and just as dangerous. At dinner, we sat at the same table, the three of us. My husband asked about his internship, nodded politely, offered vague encouragement. I watched them interact, their familiarity as family members evident and uncomplicated. And yet, the whole time, I was painfully aware of my own discomfort. My fork scraped against the plate louder than it should have. I laughed at a joke too late. I caught his gaze once across the table and looked away so quickly it felt like guilt. That night, lying beside a man who hadn't asked me how I was in months, I felt like a stranger in my own body. Not because of shame or desire, but because I had become aware of myself in a new way. Not better. Not worse. Just different. As if the mirror had tilted slightly, revealing a version of me I hadn't realized was still alive beneath the weight of routines and expectations. The next day, my husband asked him to help with the groceries. I offered to go too, out of habit more than anything, and before I could change my mind, the three of us were in the car together. I sat in the front seat, stiff and overly formal, like a guest in my own life. He sat behind me. I could feel his eyes in the rearview mirror, though he said nothing the entire ride. At the store, we split up. I took the dry goods, he went for produce. My husband wandered off somewhere in between. I found him again at the register, chatting with someone from his office. He didn't introduce me. I stood beside him, a polite smile frozen on my face, feeling more invisible than ever. On the drive home, the silence was thick. My husband scrolled through his phone at a red light, not noticing when it turned green until someone honked. I glanced back once, just once, and saw him watching me. Not staring. Just watching. As if trying to read something I hadn't written. When we got home, my husband carried the bags inside and disappeared into the den. I lingered in the kitchen, putting things away slowly. He stepped in behind me, grabbing a carton of eggs from the counter. Our hands brushed, barely. I didn't move. Neither did he. And then, just like that, we kissed. No words. No warning. Just that. It wasn't passionate or wild. It wasn't even long. But it happened. And in that single, irrevocable moment, the line we'd both been pretending didn't exist was gone. I stepped back first. My breath caught somewhere in my throat, and I turned away, pretending to be suddenly interested in the spice rack. He didn't speak. He just left the room. I stood there for what felt like hours, hands gripping the edge of the counter, heart pounding like I'd run up a flight of stairs. The quiet of the house pressed down around me. My husband's voice filtered in from the den, something about a missed call, a delayed report. Mundane. Safe. Familiar. And utterly detached from the storm I was now carrying inside me. That night, I washed my face 3 times, as if the water could rinse away what had happened. I avoided the mirror again. I couldn't bear to see what was now etched across my features. When I climbed into bed, my husband reached over absently to kiss my shoulder, the way he always did. I didn't flinch. I didn't respond. I just closed my eyes and waited for sleep that wouldn't come. Because something had started. And I didn't know how to stop it. The morning after the kiss, the house was filled with a silence that wasn't peaceful. It was thick, like fog that made it harder to breathe, harder to move without feeling its weight. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, going through the motions of my day, but my thoughts trailed behind me, scattered and unfinished. The kiss played in my head on repeat, not the physicality of it, but the meaning, or lack thereof. What had I done? What did it mean? And more terrifyingly, why didn't I feel more shame? He wasn't in the kitchen when I came down. His bedroom door was closed. I stood there for a while, mug in hand, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no clinking sounds. I wondered if he was avoiding me. Part of me hoped he was. The other part felt abandoned by his silence. I had expected some kind of reaction, a confrontation, an apology, anything that would help define the edges of what had happened. But there was nothing. And that nothing was worse. My husband, as usual, had already gone to work. He had left a note on the counter reminding me about some delivery and a drive back by 7. The sight of his handwriting made my stomach twist. I tried to remember the last time he had looked at me with anything resembling attention. I failed. Later, when I finally saw him, my nephew by marriage, he didn't mention anything. He was polite, normal. He asked if I needed help unloading groceries, and I said no, maybe too quickly. He nodded and stepped away. I watched him go, and the absence of tension felt unnatural, like a stage where the curtain had been lifted but no one came to act. The kiss hung between us, a phantom neither of us dared to acknowledge. That afternoon, I went for a walk alone. The air outside was brisk, sharp enough to wake the senses. I walked through the neighborhood, pretending I was somewhere else, someone else. The repetition of my footsteps on the pavement was comforting, almost meditative. It gave me something to focus on besides the storm inside my chest. When I returned, the house was still. I moved upstairs quietly and paused outside his door. I didn't knock. I didn't go in. I just stood there for a moment, listening to the faint sound of typing. He was working, focused, untouched by the chaos he'd helped stir in me. I walked away, unsure if I was relieved or disappointed. Dinner was uneventful. My husband was tired, distracted. He talked about some issue at the office, something about budgets and schedules. I nodded at the right times, asked a question or two. He didn't notice that I hadn't eaten much. He didn't notice that my hands trembled slightly as I set the table. He didn't notice anything. I excused myself early, citing a headache. He mumbled something in response and stayed behind to finish his meal. I went to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor for a long time. I felt like I was unraveling, thread by thread, and no one in the house could see it happening. The next day, he was gone early. A note again. I used to find these notes endearing, evidence of his care. Now, they felt like receipts. Proof of his absence, documented in ink. Around midday, my phone buzzed. A text. From him. The message was short, "I'll be out most of the day. Don't worry." I stared at it for a long time before putting the phone down. I didn't reply. What could I say? Hours passed. I cleaned. I reorganized the kitchen cabinets. I wiped surfaces that were already clean. The need to control something, anything, consumed me. The house smelled like lemon and bleach. Still, I felt dirty, as if no amount of scrubbing could clean the decisions I'd already made. When he returned, it was late afternoon. He carried a small paper bag and offered it to me without a word. Inside was a croissant, still warm. My favorite kind. I looked up at him, confused. He didn't explain. Just gave a quiet smile and walked past me into the living room. I stood there, holding the bag, and something inside me cracked. Not because of the pastry. Not because of the smile. But because he remembered. He paid attention. A detail. A small thing. And it undid me. I didn't eat it. I placed it on the table and left it untouched. That evening, I sat alone on the back patio. The sun dipped below the horizon in shades of deep orange and blue. The wind was cool. I wrapped a blanket around myself and stared into the darkening sky, hoping for clarity, for a sign, for anything that could help me decide what to do next. He came outside an hour later, wordless, holding a second cup of tea. He placed it beside me, not making eye contact, and sat down in the chair across from mine. We sat like that for a long time. The air between us hummed, not with romance, but with a mutual awareness of the thin line we were straddling. I wanted to speak. I wanted to say something to take it all back or push it forward. But the words refused to form. He didn't speak either. We just listened to the sounds of night, crickets, distant cars, the rustling of leaves. Eventually, he stood up, nodded once, and went inside. I stayed outside long after. I held the tea until it was cold. I stared at the stars and felt very far from myself. Whatever control I had felt over my life was slipping. The kiss had been a crack, and now everything was leaking through it, memories, doubts, unmet needs, long-buried desires. When I finally came inside, the house was silent again. I passed his room without pausing. I went to bed and laid down beside my husband, who was already asleep. His breathing was steady, peaceful. I watched him for a while, wondering how he could rest so easily while I felt like I was falling apart from the inside. Sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, it was shallow and restless. And in the brief moments of dreaming, I didn't see faces or places. Just a door, half open, and the feeling that once I crossed through it, I wouldn't be able to return. The days began to blur. Morning light spilled through the blinds the same way it always had, but something about it felt different now, sharper, almost accusing. My body still moved on schedule. I woke before everyone, brewed coffee, set out the cereal, folded the laundry. I smiled when I needed to, responded when spoken to. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath it, a fault line had opened, and I could feel every tremor rippling through me. He was careful around me now. Not distant exactly, but intentional. His movements were quieter. He avoided eye contact for too long or held it for just a second more than he should. There was no mention of what had happened. Not the kiss, not the croissant, not the silence that followed. It all hung between us like a curtain neither of us dared to draw back. One afternoon, my husband suggested a weekend trip to his parents' house. "We haven't visited in months," he said. "Might do us all some good." He meant it casually, with that tone he used when checking things off a list. I nodded. There was no reason to object. The day before we were to leave, I found myself sitting at the edge of my bed, suitcase open beside me, staring at a pair of earrings I hadn't worn in years. They were small, nothing dramatic, just simple silver loops. I held them in my palm for a long time. Something about the gesture felt important, like I was trying to remember who I used to be before everything became heavy and complicated. He wasn't joining us. That was the plan. He had work, papers to finish, and the drive would be long. My husband seemed mildly disappointed but didn't push. I, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of relief and something dangerously close to regret. At the house that weekend, everything felt muted. His parents were kind, gracious hosts, and I performed the role I'd always played well, helpful, polite, easy to please. I laughed at the right moments, offered to wash dishes, complimented the garden. But inside, I felt like a cardboard cutout of myself, propped up to keep the peace. On the second night, as we sat around the fire pit in their backyard, my husband leaned over and whispered, "You seem distracted lately." I froze for a heartbeat but forced a smile. "Just tired," I replied. He didn't press. He never did. That night in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours. The room smelled of old quilts and lavender sachets, the same as it always had, but it no longer comforted me. I was tired of pretending, of guessing, of holding so much in that my own voice had become a whisper inside my head. When we returned home, I noticed the air felt heavier. As if the walls knew more than they should. He was in the kitchen when we walked in, drawing a glass with casual focus. He greeted us both, then excused himself quickly, claiming a deadline. I watched him disappear down the hall, tension settling into my shoulders like weight I'd forgotten how to carry. Later that evening, while unpacking, I found a folded note tucked into one of the outside pockets of my bag. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a signature. I recognized the handwriting immediately. "You've been quiet. I'll match your silence. But I still see you." I read it 3 times before folding it again and tucking it beneath a stack of scarves in my drawer. The note itself wasn't romantic, or even suggestive. But it carried something far more dangerous as recognition. The next day, he left early. No note. No explanation. Just absence. My husband didn't comment. I didn't ask. The quiet that filled the house in his absence was different than before. It wasn't peaceful or dull, it was unnerving. Like walking through an abandoned room where the air still remembers the last conversation. I missed the sound of footsteps in the hall, the faint hum of music from his room, the accidental clinking of plates as he cleaned up after himself. I missed being noticed. 3 days passed before he returned. I heard the front door open, the zip of a suitcase being dragged across the floor, the door to the guest room clicking shut. I didn't move from the sofa. I didn't say hello. That night, I wandered into the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed. I stood by the window, watching the streetlight flicker on the sidewalk outside. My fingers traced circles on the rim of a water glass, the silence around me punctuated only by the occasional creak of old wood. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Light. Familiar. "I thought I heard you come in," I said, not turning around. He didn't reply immediately. When he did, his voice was low. "I didn't want to wake anyone." I nodded, still staring out the window. "You didn't." Silence settled again, thick and tentative. I turned slowly to face him. He looked tired, or maybe just guarded. The distance between us was small, but it felt like miles. "You didn't have to leave," I said, surprising even myself. He looked at me for a long moment. "I thought it would help." "Did it?" He didn't answer. I turned back to the window, pretending to find meaning in the glow of the street lamp. "This can't keep happening," I whispered. "I know," he said. But even as the words were spoken, I knew they were meaningless. Not because we lacked understanding, but because understanding was never the problem. It was timing. It was space. It was want. He stepped away first, offering a soft goodnight as he did. I stayed in the kitchen until the light outside turned pink with morning. I made coffee. I prepared breakfast. I greeted my husband with a tired smile and a kiss on the cheek. Routine. Expected. Safe. But inside, I was still staring out that window, reading the note in my mind, and wondering how silence could speak so loudly. There's a certain kind of fatigue that seeps into your bones when you're constantly pretending. Not from lying, necessarily, but from sustaining the weight of all the things you're not saying. I felt it most in the quiet hours, those still, late evenings when the house fell asleep, and I was left alone with my thoughts, tracing them like threads through a labyrinth I couldn't escape. Each day seemed longer now. Not because of what was happening, but because of what wasn't. The absence of acknowledgement had begun to feel heavier than any confrontation ever could. In the days following his return, we avoided each other without making it obvious. We moved around the house with deliberate timing, like dancers following separate rhythms. I heard him in the hall sometimes, or through the thin walls of the kitchen as he cleaned up after dinner, always just out of reach. He no longer lingered in the shared spaces. I no longer made excuses to pass by his room. It was as though we had both silently agreed to exist parallelly, without colliding. But avoidance, I've learned, is rarely sustainable. My husband remained blissfully unaware, immersed in his routines, his work, his endless emails and phone calls. At times, I watched him from across the room and tried to remember what it felt like when his attention made me feel grounded. Now it barely registered. He asked questions in passing, acknowledged my responses with distracted nods. He still kissed my cheek every morning, still touched my shoulder as he walked by, but it felt more like habit than intimacy. We were functioning. That was all. One afternoon, he was called out of town unexpectedly. A conference. Last minute, urgent. He packed quickly, kissed me goodbye with the same warmth he used for his coworkers, and was gone before dinner. I watched his car disappear down the street, the taillights flickering red in the dusk, and then turned back toward the house with a sense of unease I couldn't quite name. It wasn't anticipation. It wasn't fear. It was something in between, a quiet, unsettled readiness. The house felt too large without him. Too quiet. Even the ticking of the kitchen clock seemed intrusive. I tried to distract myself, folded laundry that didn't need folding, rearranged books on shelves, vacuumed a floor that was already clean. But nothing dulled the growing tension beneath my skin. I made tea and let it go cold. I checked my phone 4 times without knowing what I was looking for. Later that evening, I stepped outside onto the back patio. The night was mild, still holding on to the last breath of summer. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and sat alone, staring into the darkness, listening to the quiet rustle of leaves and distant traffic. It was strange how solitude could feel both peaceful and suffocating at the same time. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. He found me there. I heard the door open behind me, light footsteps crossing the wooden boards, then stillness. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The silence shifted in a way I had come to recognize instinctively. A pause. A presence. A pulse. "I didn't know you were out here," he said softly. "I needed air," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't sit down right away. For a moment, I thought he would leave, retreat back into his room like he had so many nights before. But then he lowered himself into the chair beside me, and we sat in silence, the space between us thick with everything unsaid. The moon was high, casting a silvery glow across the yard. I could hear the neighbors' wind chimes faintly, their notes delicate and uneven. I wrapped the shawl tighter around my shoulders, not because I was cold, but because I needed something to hold on to. "I keep thinking," I said finally, "that if I pretend hard enough, it'll all just go away." He didn't respond immediately. "Has that ever worked for you?" I smiled, though it felt brittle. "Not once." There was a long pause. "Not uncomfortable. Just full." "I didn't come out here to make things worse," he said. "I know. I don't expect anything. I know." It was the first real conversation we'd had in days, and it felt like walking across a frozen lake, carefully, slowly, afraid of the sound of cracking beneath our feet. "I think I'm more afraid of being seen than being caught," I said quietly. "Like, if someone actually looked at me, really looked, they'd know I don't have it together. That I'm not as composed as I pretend to be." He shifted in his seat. "I don't think anyone really has it together. They just get better at hiding it." His words struck something in me, something soft, vulnerable. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap, fingers knotted tightly. We sat like that for a long time, breathing the same air, letting the silence say the rest. And then, we kissed. We kissed. No preamble. No hesitation. Just the quiet slide of breath turning into something neither of us could name. It wasn't hungry or desperate. It wasn't reckless. It was soft. Intentional. A confirmation of everything that had been simmering in the background of our days and nights. A release, not of passion, but of pressure. A truth finally acknowledged. I pulled away first. I didn't look at him. My heart was loud in my chest, louder than the crickets, louder than the silence that followed. I should go inside, I said, though I didn't move. He nodded. Okay. But neither of us got up right away. When I finally did, I didn't say goodnight. I didn't look back. I went straight to the bathroom, locked the door behind me, and stood at the sink gripping the edge like it was the only thing keeping me upright. My reflection in the mirror didn't look different. But I felt different. Not lighter. Not freer. Just more real. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the occasional creak of wood as the house settled around me. My husband's side of the bed was empty, and still I couldn't relax. There was too much noise inside my head, thoughts folding over themselves, memories overlapping with emotions I didn't yet know how to name. Some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. And no matter how quietly they're stepped over, their echoes linger long after. The days that followed unfolded with a quietness that unsettled me more than confrontation ever could. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confessions. Just life, continuing, steady, unremarkable, almost eerily so. And that's what made it worse. Because inside me, everything was shifting. Every routine now felt like a performance. Every word, a rehearsed line in a script I no longer believed in. My husband returned from his trip 2 days later. He brought home a small souvenir, one of those novelty mugs with the name of the city scrawled across it in looping letters. He placed it on the kitchen counter with a smile, kissed my cheek, and asked how things had been. I smiled back, said everything was fine, and thanked him for the mug. That was it. That was all. He didn't notice the pause in my voice. He didn't see how I flinched slightly at his touch. Or if he did, he chose not to acknowledge it. I wondered sometimes whether that was his way of loving, by not looking too closely, by giving me space disguised as indifference. There had been a time when I might have appreciated that. Now it felt like abandonment painted as politeness. We returned to our rhythm, if you could call it that. Morning coffee. Separate workspaces. Shared meals punctuated by shallow conversation. Evenings spent on opposite ends of the couch, each lost in our respective distractions. There were moments when I almost convinced myself that everything was under control. That I could tuck the truth away in some quiet corner of my mind and carry on. But that illusion never lasted long. He and I, my husband's nephew, we maintained our distance. Not just physically, but in all the little ways that matter. We avoided being in the same room for too long. We spoke in clipped, polite sentences. We behaved like two people who had never shared anything beyond the superficial. It was exhausting. Every glance that didn't linger, every gesture that stopped short, it all required effort. And the more I tried to suppress what had happened, the more present it became in my thoughts. One morning, I found myself alone in the laundry room, folding towels. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that made you aware of your own heartbeat. I was halfway through smoothing the edges of a white bath towel when I noticed it, his scent. Faint, familiar, clinging to the fabric like a memory I hadn't asked for. I froze. The towel slipped from my hands and fell to the floor. I stood there, staring at it, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the scent itself that undid me, it was what it represented. Presence. Proximity. The reminder that, no matter how hard I tried to create distance, the imprint of what had happened remained. That afternoon, my husband announced he'd be working late. A meeting had run over, followed by dinner with colleagues. I nodded, pretending not to register the now familiar sense of relief that passed through me when he said it. I hated that feeling. Hated what it said about me. He left around 5. I busied myself with dinner prep, more out of habit than hunger. I chopped vegetables I didn't intend to cook. Boiled water I didn't use. I moved around the kitchen with the kind of restless energy that made even silence feel too loud. As I stood at the counter, peeling carrots, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. "You don't have to pretend, you know," he said quietly. His voice startled me, not because it was unexpected, but because it was real. Not forced. Not polite. Just honest. I placed the peeler down and turned slowly to face him. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "I'm not pretending," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. He didn't press. Just nodded and stepped back, as if giving me permission to retreat if I needed to. But I didn't move. "I've been trying to forget," I said, not quite sure who I was confessing to, him or myself. Trying to act like it didn't mean anything. "And did it?" he asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. Instead, I turned away and walked to the sink, running the water, letting it drown out the noise in my head. He didn't follow. Later that evening, I found a note tucked under the edge of the fruit bowl. It wasn't long. Just a single sentence, scrawled in careful handwriting. "You don't have to disappear to stay invisible." I folded the note without reading it again and placed it inside a cookbook I rarely opened. There was something fitting about that, burying a truth inside something meant for creation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the fan above casting shifting shadows across the room. My husband slept beside me, his breathing steady, his presence familiar but distant. I thought about how much of our life was built on things unsaid. The spaces between words. The glances we chose not to interpret. The truths we pretended didn't matter. The next day, I suggested to my husband that we take a weekend trip together. Just the two of us. It wasn't spontaneous, I had thought about it for days. He looked surprised, but agreed almost immediately. "Where did you have in mind?" he asked. "Somewhere quiet," I said. "Somewhere we can talk." He nodded, and for the first time in a while, he looked at me, not past me, not through me, but at me. It didn't erase anything. But it was something. That evening, I packed a small bag. Just a few things, clothes, toiletries, a book I hadn't finished. As I zipped it shut, I glanced at the window and saw him standing outside in the garden, hands in his pockets, looking up at the sky. I watched him for a long moment. He didn't turn. Didn't move. Just stood there, still and quiet, like he was waiting for the world to tell him what to do next. And maybe I was doing the same. Waiting. Listening. Caught between the comfort of what I knew and the ache of what I couldn't name. The lines were no longer blurred. They were sharp now. Clear. But clarity doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes, it just gives you a better view of everything you're about to lose. The weekend trip had been my idea, but once we were on the road, I found myself retreating inward, unsure of what I was hoping to accomplish. My husband drove, humming softly under his breath to some old song on the radio. The sun was low, casting long streaks of light across the windshield, and I watched them stretch and break across the dashboard like quiet reminders of time passing. We didn't speak much during the drive. Small talk came and went, traffic, the weather, memories of previous trips we had taken. But underneath it all was the silence I'd come to recognize, the kind that carried weight. It wasn't hostile or cold. It was cautious. As if both of us knew something fragile was between us, and we weren't sure if touching it would shatter it or bring it into focus. The cabin was tucked into a quiet wooded area just outside the city. It was modest but comfortable, with wooden beams across the ceiling and large windows that let in the soft blue of evening. I unpacked our things while he lit a fire in the small brick fireplace. It crackled to life slowly, filling the room with warmth that didn't quite reach the space between us. After dinner, simple pasta and wine, we sat near the fire, each in our own chair. He scrolled through his phone for a while. I stared into the flames, mesmerized by their slow, uneven dance. The wine sat untouched in my glass. Eventually, he put his phone down and looked over at me. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said. I didn't answer immediately. I didn't want to lie, but the truth was too tangled to unravel in one sitting. "I guess I've been thinking," I said finally. "About what?" "About everything," I replied. It wasn't specific, but it wasn't untrue. He leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. "Sometimes I worry I haven't been present enough." That surprised me. I looked at him, really looked, and saw something there I hadn't noticed in a long time, an uncertainty, a quiet reaching for something he couldn't quite name. "I think we both stepped back at some point," I said. "Maybe we didn't notice it right away, but we did." He didn't argue. Instead, he said something that caught me off guard. "I've missed you." It wasn't a dramatic declaration. There was no weight of desperation in it. Just honesty. A soft admission of absence. I set my glass down and stood, walking toward the window. Outside, the sky was already dark. Trees stood silhouetted against the moonlight, still and silent. I wrapped my arms around myself, not because I was cold, but because I needed something to hold. "I've missed you too," I said quietly. The rest of the evening passed gently. No confrontation, no sudden breakthroughs. Just the slow, careful return to shared space. We went to bed early, both tired, both silent. He reached for my hand in the dark, and I let him take it. His fingers were warm. Familiar. We spent the night together. The morning came with a softness I hadn't expected. I woke to the sound of birdsong and the scent of coffee brewing. He was already up, standing in the kitchen, reading something on his phone with a relaxed posture I hadn't seen in months. He looked over when I entered and smiled. "Morning." "Morning," I replied. We shared breakfast quietly. Pancakes and fruit. He poured syrup with an absent-minded focus, and I found myself watching him, trying to see him the way I might have once, before the distance grew too wide to cross. After we ate, we went for a walk through the woods behind the cabin. The trail was uneven, scattered with fallen leaves and sticks, but beautiful. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of damp earth and pine. We didn't hold hands. We didn't need to. Just walking side by side felt like a kind of progress. There were moments when I wanted to tell him everything. To confess the kiss. The pull I hadn't been able to resist. But every time I opened my mouth, something in me hesitated. Was it fear? Guilt? A desire to protect what was left? I didn't know. That evening, we packed up and returned home. The house was quiet when we arrived. I unpacked slowly, methodically. Placed everything where it belonged. But something in me felt out of place. Like I had left a part of myself in that cabin and wasn't sure whether to grieve or feel relieved. He was in the kitchen when we got back, sitting at the table with a cup of tea, a book open in front of him. He looked up when we entered, eyes flicking between us, reading the subtle shift in energy. "Nice trip?" he asked. My husband nodded. It was. I forced a smile. Very peaceful. He looked at me for a beat longer than necessary. Then he stood, picked up his tea, and walked out of the room without another word. Later that night, after my husband had gone to bed, I sat alone on the back patio. The air was cooler now, the season beginning its slow turn. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stared out into the dark yard, lit only by the dim porch light. Footsteps behind me. I didn't have to look. "You're back," he said. "I am." "How was it?" "Quiet." We didn't speak after that. He stood beside me for a moment, then walked to the edge of the patio and stared out into the yard, hands in his pockets. The silence stretched between us, not tense but full. "You seem different," he said. "Maybe I am." He nodded. "That's allowed." I looked down at my hands. My wedding ring caught the light, glinting softly. I turned it slowly around my finger, not out of doubt, but contemplation. I didn't know what was next. I didn't know what I wanted. But for the first time in a long time, I felt awake. Present. Aware of myself in a way that was both painful and necessary. He didn't stay long. Just a few minutes. Then he turned and walked back into the house, the door closing behind him with a soft click. I stayed outside until the chill finally sank into my bones. And when I went inside, the house felt both familiar and foreign, like a space I had lived in for years but was only just beginning to truly see. The days after the trip passed slowly, but not in the way they once had. It wasn't the dull repetition of domestic routine that dragged me down now, it was the quiet aftermath of something too complicated to define. I felt suspended in the middle of a shift I couldn't name. Like the house, my body, and my life were all holding their breath, waiting for something inevitable to arrive. My husband returned to his usual rhythm with ease. Early mornings, coffee brewed before sunrise, the hum of his electric razor through the bathroom door. He moved with the same predictability as before, but now I noticed every detail. I watched the way he looked at his phone longer than he looked at me. The way he answered questions with nods instead of words. He hadn't changed, but I had. And that difference made everything feel louder, starker. There was a moment on a Thursday morning that I can't forget. I had just stepped out of the shower and was brushing my hair when I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I froze. Not because of how I looked, but because, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure who I was seeing. The woman in the reflection wasn't just tired. She was distant. Guarded. She looked like someone carrying a truth she no longer knew how to set down. I put the brush down and walked out of the bathroom. I wandered the house aimlessly, barefoot, trailing my fingertips along the walls as if searching for reassurance in the textures of the familiar. Nothing offered it. Later that day, I opened the kitchen drawer to look for scissors and instead found a receipt from the trip, folded, faded, almost insignificant. A gas station purchase. A bottle of water and a candy bar. But it sent a pang through me, sharp and uninvited. I stared at it for a moment, then placed it back and closed the drawer gently, as though being too rough might wake the feelings I'd been trying to bury. He and I rarely crossed paths that week. When we did, it was brief, passing in the hallway, sharing space at the dining table, exchanging polite words like we were acquaintances in a shared flat. The air between us had changed again. The tension was still there, but it had cooled. Hardened into something brittle and careful. One night, I found myself lying awake again. My husband had fallen asleep easily, his breathing deep and even beside me. I stared at the ceiling, eyes dry, thoughts restless. Eventually, I slipped out of bed and walked to the kitchen, the house dark and still. I stood in front of the sink, not doing anything, just existing. My hands rested on the counter. My shoulders slumped with exhaustion I hadn't earned from physical labor. I felt heavy in a way no sleep could fix. Behind me, I heard a chair shift. A quiet scrape of wood against tile. I turned slowly. He was there. Sitting at the kitchen table, one hand wrapped around a mug, the other resting on the back of his neck. He didn't look surprised to see me. Just tired. I couldn't sleep, I said, barely above a whisper. Me neither, he replied. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. We didn't speak for a long time. The refrigerator hummed softly. A tree branch tapped against the window in the breeze. He broke the silence first. Did the trip help? I don't know, I answered honestly. I think it made things clearer. But clarity doesn't always feel good. He nodded slowly. No, it doesn't. There was a pause. I've thought a lot about what happened, he said. And I keep asking myself if I regret it. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words clung to the air, heavy and delicate. I don't, he said. But I also don't expect you to carry it the same way. I looked down at my water glass, the condensation dripping onto my fingers. I wiped it absently on the hem of my shirt. It wasn't supposed to happen, I said. I know. But it did. I know. The truth settled between us like dust in a beam of moonlight. Visible. Unavoidable. But still, no one reached to clean it away. Eventually, I walked back to bed. I lay down slowly, careful not to wake my husband, and stared at the ceiling until the lines blurred and sleep finally took me. The next morning, I felt hollowed out but strangely focused. Like a decision had begun to form in the corners of my mind, even if I wasn't ready to speak it aloud yet. I spent most of the day outside in the garden. Pulling weeds. Watering the plants. Trimming the hedges. My hands ached from the effort, but the pain grounded me. Dirt under my nails. Sweat on my forehead. It felt honest. Real. In the afternoon, I came inside and found a small envelope on the kitchen counter. My name written on the front in his handwriting. I opened it slowly, unfolding the lined paper inside. I'm leaving, it said. I need space. For me, and for you. This isn't me running. It's me letting you breathe. That was all. I read it twice. Then a third time. And I sat down at the table, the letter still in my hand, and stared at the empty chair across from me. He didn't come home that night. I didn't cry. I cleaned the kitchen. I folded the laundry. I made the bed. I brushed my teeth. I climbed into bed beside my husband and turned off the light. But sleep didn't come. All I could hear was the echo of footsteps that wouldn't return. The sound of a door closing, not with anger, but with something far harder to face, finality. And in that silence, I began to understand the difference between loneliness and being alone. The next morning began like all the others, but it felt off in a way I couldn't immediately name. The sunlight poured into the kitchen at a slightly different angle. The floor creaked beneath my steps with unfamiliar hesitation. The coffee tasted the same, but I drank it slower, as if trying to stretch the comfort it offered. His absence wasn't loud. It was subtle. A quiet vacancy that lingered in the corners of the house like a forgotten scent. I didn't speak of it to my husband. I didn't explain the envelope. I tucked it into a drawer beneath a stack of receipts and old birthday cards and said nothing. Throughout the day, I moved with a kind of numb precision. I organized the linen closet. I dusted the baseboards. I rearranged the spices in alphabetical order, something I had never done before, something that felt both ridiculous and necessary. I found solace in the small decisions I could control. Paprika before rosemary. Cinnamon after chili. These things made sense, at least. These things stayed where I put them. At lunch, my husband suggested dinner out that evening. A small Italian place we used to go to, before everything started feeling like maintenance. I agreed. Not because I wanted to. Not because I thought it would fix anything. But because I didn't want to sit across from the empty chair at our own table again. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I changed my outfit twice. Not for him. Not for the restaurant. For me. For the woman who needed to remember what it felt like to choose how she appeared, not just how she functioned. I settled on a soft blue blouse and black slacks. Simple. Clean. Presentable. I tied my hair back and left the makeup drawer untouched. At dinner, we made polite conversation. He complimented the food. I smiled. He asked about my week. I gave a vague summary. There was no spark. But there was civility. And in a strange way, that felt like progress. We walked back to the car under a navy sky. He didn't reach for my hand. I didn't offer it. Back home, I poured myself a glass of water and lingered in the kitchen while he retreated to the den. I stared at the counter, my reflection faint in the window above the sink. I looked tired. But not broken. And that, I told myself, mattered. The days stretched on. He didn't return. No messages. No updates. Nothing more than the note I'd already memorized. I waited at first. Then I let go of waiting. I returned to routine, not because I wanted to reclaim it, but because I needed somewhere to place my energy. The garden flourished. The closets gleamed. Even the garage, long neglected, took on an order it hadn't seen in years. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I heard the front door open and close. My heart skipped, then settled. My husband. Of course. It was too early for guests, too late for deliveries. I heard the sound of keys on the table, the rustle of a jacket being hung. Familiar rhythms. Predictable sounds. But then came a shift. I was in the bedroom when he entered, holding something in his hand. I looked up from the laundry basket and immediately, I knew. The expression on his face wasn't confusion. It wasn't curiosity. It was something colder. Sharper. He held my tablet. I don't know how long he had been holding it. Or how many messages he had read. But his silence told me it had been long enough. I was looking for the receipt from the plumber, he said. His voice was calm, almost casual. And this was open. He didn't hold up the screen. He didn't ask a question. He didn't yell. That made it worse. I froze, one hand still resting on a folded towel. My mouth went dry. I didn't speak. There was no explanation that would soften the truth. No excuse that would make it less real. He set the tablet down gently on the dresser. He didn't look at me. Just stared past me, into the space where the mirror hung. His reflection seemed smaller than it had hours before. I need some time, he said, finally. I nodded, my throat too tight to form words. He picked up his keys, walked out, and closed the door behind him. No suitcase. No slammed drawers. No accusations. Just an echo. The house felt suddenly colder. The light dimmer. I sat on the edge of the bed, the towel still folded in my lap, and let the silence press in. The rest of the day passed like a blur. I moved slowly, mechanically. I checked the mailbox. I watered the plants. I ignored the vibration of my phone on the kitchen counter. By evening, the reality of what had happened began to sink into my skin. He knew. My husband. The man who had once kissed my shoulder every morning and now couldn't bring himself to look me in the eye. There was no denying it anymore. The lie I had been living inside had finally burst open, and the air outside felt thin and unfamiliar. I went to bed early. Not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to sit in the living room and face the empty chair again. I turned off the lights, crawled under the sheets, and stared at the ceiling. In the darkness, everything echoed louder. Every word unspoken. Every glance avoided. Every quiet betrayal. And through it all, a single thought circled like a bird that refused to land. This was the beginning of the end. Or maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something else entirely. The morning after he left with the tablet still burned into my memory like a brand. I woke early, not from an alarm or noise, but from a jolt of awareness that cracked through my chest before my eyes even opened. The sheets beside me were untouched. He hadn't returned during the night. I stared at the empty space for a long time, wondering if it was still mine to share. If anything was. I got up slowly, my body moving with the heaviness of someone trying to lift an invisible weight. The house felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because something essential had been exposed. The walls, the furniture, the stillness, they all felt like witnesses now. There was no undoing what had happened. No quieting the echo of his silence. I made coffee, even though I didn't want it. The ritual felt necessary. Something to hold in my hands. I sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from the mug, staring out the window at the garden I had spent so many afternoons tending. It was still beautiful, still green, still growing. A reminder that life didn't pause for heartbreak. It just kept moving, whether or not you were ready. The hours passed slowly. I didn't check my phone. I didn't open my email. I didn't speak to anyone. I wandered the house like it was a museum of choices I couldn't take back. Every object carried memory. Every room held a moment I had lived inside while lying to someone who trusted me. I paused by the door to his room, the one that had been temporarily occupied, then permanently altered. It was closed. I didn't open it. By afternoon, the sun hung low and gold over the porch. I stepped outside with a sweater wrapped around my shoulders and sank into the chair by the railing. The breeze was gentle, brushing leaves across the deck in slow circles. I stared ahead without seeing much, just letting the weight inside me settle. That's when I heard the door open behind me. I didn't turn. I knew the difference between familiar footsteps and strangers. These were his. He didn't say anything at first. He stood there for a moment, then moved to the edge of the patio and leaned on the railing. His presence was quiet, but not hesitant. I waited. I wasn't going to come back, he said finally, voice low. But then I thought, maybe I owe you a goodbye. I swallowed hard. The air felt thick. Maybe I owe myself one, he added. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to speak. He didn't wait for me to. I've been thinking a lot, he said. About what it meant. What it didn't. About the space I filled. Or tried to. Maybe it wasn't mine to fill. Maybe it never should have been. His words weren't angry. They weren't even sad. They were calm. Measured. The voice of someone who had been turning thoughts over in his mind for days, sandpapering the edges until they no longer cut. I didn't come to change anything, he continued. I wanted to make sure you knew I didn't regret knowing you. Or seeing you. He turned then, finally looking at me. His expression was soft. Clear. And in that moment, I saw not the boy who had entered our home weeks ago, but the man who had chosen to walk out of it. I'm going to leave tonight, he said. For good. I just thought you should hear it from me. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He stood for a moment longer, then stepped down from the porch and walked toward the street. I didn't watch him go. I just closed my eyes and let the silence settle again. That evening, I opened the drawer where I had hidden his first note. I took it out and unfolded it, smoothing the creases with careful fingers. Then I added the second note, the one from the fruit bowl. And then the third. I stacked them all together, wrapped them in a plain handkerchief, and tucked them into the bottom of a small box in my closet. Not to keep. But not to forget. Later that night, my husband came home. He didn't say where he had been. I didn't ask. He placed his keys on the table, removed his shoes, and sat down on the couch. I joined him in silence. The TV was on, playing something neither of us cared about. He didn't look at me, but his presence was no longer indifferent. It was aware. There was something simmering beneath his stillness, something more complex than anger. After a long while, he spoke. I read everything. I turned to him slowly. He was still looking straight ahead. I don't know what to do with it yet, he said. I don't know if I can move past it. But I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. I didn't reply. What could I say? There were no explanations left. No stories to soften the truth. The damage had been done, and now we were both standing in its wreckage, deciding which pieces to pick up. I'm staying at a hotel for a few nights, he said. I need space to think. I nodded. He stood, grabbed his coat, and walked to the door. I'll call you in a few days, he said without turning around. And then he left. When the door closed, I sat alone in the quiet and let the full weight of it fall. Not the loneliness. Not the guilt. But the realization that this was the consequence. Not drama. Not chaos. Just distance. Just time. I didn't cry. Instead, I got up, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the window watching the last bit of daylight slip away. I thought about choices, and how small they seem in the moment. A word. A glance. A single step in a different direction. How those moments, barely noticed at first, grow into fault lines beneath your life. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know if my marriage would survive. I didn't know if I would ever see him again. But I knew one thing with certainty. Something had ended. And something else, something quieter, perhaps lonelier, but undeniably more honest, had begun.